Here is the walkthrough for chapter 15. This is the triumphant chapter that corrects the tragedy of chapter 13. Week 2, God's presence is everything. Chapter 15, bringing the ark, God's way. Having learned a hard lesson about God's holiness, David now prepares to make a second attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This chapter is all about doing things the right way. It is a story of careful preparation, reverence, obedience, and an explosion of joyful worship. David successfully brings the symbol of God's presence to the heart of the nation. A breakdown of the chapter. 1. Careful preparation, verses 1 to 2. David begins by preparing a special place for the ark, a tent he had pitched for it in Jerusalem. Then he gives the crucial command that shows he has learned his lesson. None ought to carry the ark of God but the Levites. For them hath the Lord chosen to carry the ark of God, and to minister unto him forever. He now understands that God's presence must be handled according to God's specific instructions. 2. Sanctification and assembly, verses 3 to 15. David assembles all of Israel, especially the priests and the Levites. He speaks to their leaders and acknowledges his previous error directly. Because ye did it not at the first, the Lord our God made a breach upon us, for that we sought him not after the due order. Version 13. He then commands the priests and Levites to sanctify themselves, to go through a process of ritual purification, to prepare themselves to handle something so holy. The Levites then do exactly as Moses commanded, carrying the ark on their shoulders, using the poles. 3. A joyful, worship-filled procession, verses 16 to 28. With the ark being carried correctly and reverently, the fear from chapter 13 is replaced by unrestrained joy. David appoints the Levitical musicians and singers, Heman, Asaph, and Ethan are named again, to lead the celebration with cymbals, psalteries, and harps, lifting up the voice with joy. David himself is dressed in a linen ephod, a priestly garment, and is described as leaping and dancing as the ark enters the city. The procession is loud, musical, and full of celebration. 4. A contemptuous reaction, verse 29. The chapter ends on a sour note. As the joyful procession enters the city, David's wife Michal, the daughter of Saul, looks out her window. Seeing her husband leaping and dancing, she despised him in her heart. Her reaction shows the difference between a heart full of religious pride, like her father Saul, and a heart full of genuine, uninhibited worship for God, like David. Connecting to our theme, God's presence is everything. This chapter is the climax of our weekly theme. David shows that he now fully understands what it means to honor God's presence. It requires preparation and holiness. You can't just rush into the presence of God. We must prepare our hearts and sanctify ourselves, acknowledging his holiness. It requires obedience to his word. David sought God after the due order, following the specific instructions in the law. Honoring God's presence means honoring his word. It results in explosive joy. When God's presence is approached with reverence and obedience, the proper response is not quiet fear, but loud, unrestrained, and joyful worship. David successfully brought the ark home, making God's presence the literal and spiritual center of his kingdom. Reflection, questions for your group. 1. David openly admitted his previous mistake, version 13. Why is it important for leaders, and for all of us, to acknowledge when we've done something the wrong way? 2. The Levites had to sanctify themselves. What are some ways we can prepare our hearts before we come to worship God, whether at church or in our personal quiet time? 3. David, the powerful king, danced with abandon before the Lord, but his wife Michal despised him for it. What does this teach us about caring more about what God thinks of our worship than what other people think? Key takeaway for chapter 15. When we honor God's presence through obedience and holiness, it removes fear and unleashes true heartfelt joy.